welcome you to the BridgeGap Talk Series, Anticorruption in Progress, Episode 2. So the series is brought to you by the researchers of the Horizon Europe-funded BridgeGap project, bridging gaps in evidence regulation and impact of anti-corruption policies. The series aims to provide a forum for knowledge sharing and discussion with BridgeGap researchers and their recently authored papers. So some housekeeping rules for today. We'll have a discussion for 1 hour. Please stay muted during the paper presentation so that everybody can hear this very well. You can always write any questions you have in the chat anytime. And the recordings and the slides will be shared right after we have the BridgeGap Talk series in the coming days. The moderator of today's episode is Denise Rodriguez and presenter Bernhard Reinsberg. They both will engage you in the discussion of this BridgeGap Talk Series episode 2 on business interactions with government when administrative burdens become corruption catalyst. Very timely topic. So my name is Marieke Willems. I'm tasked with the coordination of the BridgeGap project, and I really look forward to learning more about this paper in this very engaging discussion. So Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marieke. Welcome, everybody. This is part of joint work with Bernhard, led by Bernhard and with Adina Dudau, and we're part of the Work Package 4 of BridgeGap project, which focuses on the assessing, benchmarking, and modeling the integrity management systems of public, private, and hybrid organizations within the European Union. And as such, this paper draws on data from private organizations, firms, to test the grease the wheels hypothesis. So the analysis is based on an extensive database covering more than 140 countries, providing a comprehensive perspective on the links of corruption and administrative burdens in integrity management dynamics. So Bernhard Reinsberg is a professor of the International Political Economy and Development of the University of Glasgow and a research associate in political economy at the Center of Business Research at the University of Cambridge. His research is on the political economy of international organizations, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and seeks to contribute to better understanding what drives their behavior and what their development intervention are effective. And as awardee of the UKRA Future Leader Fellowship, he examines the impact of earmarked funding to international organizations and their ability to contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Bernhard?
Thank you, Denise, for a kind introduction. Again, welcome everybody. I'm presenting joint work here from Team Glasgow, Work Package 4, together with Denise and Adina. And as she already introduced, what we're doing here in this paper is to examine whether administrative burdens make firms more likely to pay bribes to public officials to get things done. And to do so, we collect World Bank Enterprise Survey data from up to 200,000 firms in over 155 countries from 2006 to 2022. And we indeed find evidence of a strong link between administrative burdens and bribe payments. And that holds generally across countries. So our results really question accounts that portray corruption purely as a development issue. But let me start at the beginning and motivate a little bit our inquiry here. So the guiding question for us is, why is corruption actually so persistent? And a lot of ink has been spilled on this question for decades. And researchers have emphasized, first and foremost, weak governance and accountability mechanisms. So they've looked at the role of democracy or presidentialism versus parliamentarism, specifically the detection and enforcement institutions within countries that could have an effect on how prevalent corruption is in a country. Others have focused on the role of social norms and cultural factors. For instance, in some societies, certain forms of corruption, such as nepotism, or kleptocracy or patronage, may be deeply ingrained in cultural practices and can make it difficult to challenge and change these behaviors. And then there's also work around the vicious circle of endemic corruption, where when corruption is so pervasive, it can become normalized and individuals might feel compelled to participate because everybody else is doing it. So this is a very difficult logic to break of this self-reinforcing corruption. Against this background, we emphasize the role of administrative burdens as a driver of low-intensity corruption, or day-to-day corruption, if you want, which nonetheless can impose economically significant costs and halt development. So the UN, for instance, estimates that about $1 trillion every year gets lost in corrupt dealings. So this is hugely, problematic, of course, for the development of poor nations. Administrative burdens, just to define them, are obstacles that individuals or firms encounter when interacting with government policies and which they perceive often as onerous or complex. So citizens and firms may be incentivized to offer informal payments to get around these obstacles, right? To get things done. And previous studies have examined the drivers and consequences of these forms of administrative corruption. For instance, in a study by Nieto Morales, Peters, and Lotta, those authors focus on the prevalence of or attempted bribery in more than 63,000 interactions across 20 different types of encounters with officials by citizens in Mexico. So this is a single country study with individual level data. The second noteworthy study is the one by Gauthier, Goyette, and Huame in 2021, who show that corruption in tax is often driven by demand-side considerations. So from bureaucrats that have the power to exploit arbitrary tax rules or And then they also could compare that to public procurement, essentially, where they find that this is often supply side driven. So from the firms themselves offering bribes to win public contracts. So this must be also firms that have certain capacity to do these things. And they use World Bank enterprise survey data from 18,000 firms. So this already cross-country study at the level of individual firms that our work connects very well to, but extends also in important ways, as I will show in the next few slides. Great. So basically taking all these prior insights together, we have a strong prior expectation on the relationship here between administrative burdens and corruption. And we simply expect that firms that face a higher level of administrative burdens are more likely to pay bribes. And this mechanism should be more pronounced where public officials have greater opportunity for bribe requests due to what, say, many international institutions would call structural distortions, right? So precisely these kind of arbitrary regulations that are put in place that bureaucrats can exploit to demand bribes. So I think in this context, it's sort of important to acknowledge the bidirectional relationship here between these administrative burdens and corruption. But we remain agnostic as to the origin of these distortions, right? So it might be that corruption might be strategically created by bureaucrats to extract rents. Nonetheless, we believe that it's important to study the responses by firms to those administrative burdens, whether real or perceived. So looking at our research design, we constructed a data set, a longitudinal data set of, again, up to 200,000 firms from 155 countries observed between 2006 and 2022. And that's basically the World Bank enterprise surveys out there. Our outcome variables measure both the bribe incidence, so whether a firm paid any bribe to get things done, but also the amount in percent of their sales that went into bribes. our independent variables that seek to capture these administrative burdens. First are the waiting times in days for a business license. So that's an objective indicator really of such burdens. And second, perceived obstacles to business due to licensing and permits. So that's more of a subjective indicator. Yeah, just to give you a bit of a more detailed flavor of this outcome variable, here I quote the exact question text as it appears in the survey. It is said that establishments are sometimes required to make gifts or informal payments to public officials to get things done regarding customs, taxes, licenses, regulations, or services. On average, what percentage of total annual sales or estimated total annual value do establishments like this one pay in informal payments or gifts to public officials for this purpose? So this question is framed in a more indirect sense, establishments like these, right, which is very advantageous for our purposes because, you know, it tries to address this social desirability bias, right, where people would probably not want to disclose that they were engaged in sort of bribes. So this is a more distanced way of asking, right? But that nonetheless gets at the gist of this idea of bribery. And as you would probably expect, there are some differences across countries, with the largest bribe incidents occurring in low-income countries. And then it gradually sort of declines over lower middle income, upper middle income, and high-income countries. Turning to the independent variable waiting time, the question reads, approximately how many days did it take to obtain an operating license from the day of the application to the day it was granted? And again, this is sort of trying to capture an objective measure of administrative burdens. But here the differences across country groups are not so close cut, precisely because high-income economies are often very structurally complex economies. We would potentially expect those waiting times to be higher, despite the better state capacity and administrative capacity that these states have. But what you can clearly see is that the variance in waiting times is much smaller, right? So there are fewer outliers. Things tend to cluster a bit more closely together in these high-income countries, which suggests that sort of what really matters is this unequal treatment and arbitrary treatment in terms of whether you get your license approved in a couple of days or not, is really what is a nuisance to firms, right? That they often try to circumvent through bribes. So yeah, we still believe that this is a very valid measure of administrative burdens. Now, using these measures, we deploy those in an ordinary least squares regression framework. And our primary strategy for inference is to include higher order fixed effects, which obviates the need to include lots of controls, say at the country level, which we are reluctant to do for various reasons, data availability being one, but also it's exactly identifies the type of variation that we are interested in. So specifically, we include country wave fixed effects, which means we only compare firms within a given country wave or country survey. And then we also include firm sector fixed effects, which means that we only compare across firms within the same sector of operation, acknowledging that there might be vast differences, say, between textiles or mining or services in terms of corruption practices, right? So all of these things now are being sort of excluded or already taken care of, which lets us focus more on these firm level controls that sort of are the remaining variation that we're interested in. So of course, we need to account for firm ownership structure, right? Whether you have domestic or foreign ownership, firm size, so small, medium enterprises versus large companies, right? And then whether firms primarily produce for the domestic market or whether they export. Drawing on previous literature, these are sort of the main controls that we draw on here. We also use survey weights provided by the surveys to ensure that our results are representative. So they really sort of capture the economic structure and firm demography within these country waves. Great. So let's turn to the key results here. As you can see in these tables, waiting time is positively correlated with our measures of corruption. So both in terms of the dichotomous indicator, any bribe paid, as well as with the continuous version of that, so the locked bribe paid in percent of sales, and in terms of effect size here, a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting time, so that would be around 50% more waiting time, would translate into a 0.6 percentage point increase in the likelihood of bribe payments and a 1.7 percentage point increase in the amount of bribes paid. And that, might look small, but it's actually quite substantial considering that firms on average pay around 6-7% of their sales in informal payments. So yeah, compared to that mean in the sample, it's quite a substantive effect that we identify, and by far the most important covariate here in our regressions. We, of course, face some inferential threats to our analysis here. Of course, that could be related to either reverse causality, whereby, this idea of corruption is more of a strategic use by bureaucrats that try to extract these rents through creating administrative burdens. Another one would be selection effects. So not all firms apply for licenses in our sample, and that might be systematically related in unobserved ways to whether they pay bribes or not. To circumvent these problems, we draw on an instrumentation strategy, actually, deploying 2 different instruments to, ensure that our results are not driven by particular choice of instruments. So our first one is to just use a binary indicator for new firms, as those we expect to be particularly likely to require a license when they start business, right? That's the first thing you need. And that indeed is a very strong predictor of being in the sample, and responding to that question. And the second one is sort of a spatial instrument that uses the sector share of firms requesting a license. So, of course, some sectors might just not be in a position to require a license, right? And so we sort of, predict or purge that individual level variation and predict that via the sort of average of licensing requirements within that sector. So again, a very strong instrument that predicts our key independent variable quite well. So when we deploy these instrument variables, we continue to find a positive, significant relationship between waiting times and bribe incidence. And the coefficient magnitudes are actually very similar to our main model. So that's also very reassuring. Here we have the results again. So you can see even the significance level has further increased compared to our baseline specifications. So that's good news. Conduct a couple of further analysis, one using perception-based indicators that has the advantage of expectations and perceptions around all sorts of things, so they don't have to have experienced this corruption. We find similar results. We also explore the macro level context in the sense that we had expected our results to be less pronounced in societies where more public services are removed from the purview of public officials, right? So where they had a lot of privatization already had happened in the past, for instance. And indeed, we do find that more market liberal societies appear to provide more insurance against this administrative corruption. The effects aren't as strong in liberal market societies. However, we are very cautious to, deduce any policy recommendations from that, as previous literature has shown that the process of privatization can be fraught with lots of corruption and generating new rent-seeking opportunities. So, and we also test our mechanisms for other licenses, public utilities, for instance, water, electricity, and so on. And we find also positive effects there. But these effects are, again, stronger where utilities are under state control. So precisely where, officials also actually have the discretion to, take bribes. So just in summary, our contribution again, we demonstrate that administrative burdens become catalysts for corruption using the largest hitherto available data set from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. Our studies thereby bridges two existing strands in the literature on corruption, focusing on either developing countries or developed countries, whereas, the beauty of our approach is to have all countries included and showing that, developmental issue. And as concerns the results by Nieto Morales and co-authors, we sort of replicate their findings with respect to businesses dealing with public officials rather than only citizens. And their study also was just focused on Mexico. So we also claim to, show results for a larger number of countries. So I want to end with a couple of next steps that we have already, started looking into. Of course, the key question is what follows from this? Can we deduce any policy interventions here? And of course, I already cautioned against changing the macro level environment, as this could create problems on their own. But of course, there are important micro level dynamics here at play, right? So for instance, is there a role for women entrepreneurs, right, as sort of brakemen against corruption or corrupt practices? And just want to show you one graph really in this type of analysis that we have already done, which is striking to us indeed, that we find that the share of firms that were asked for a bribe are massively lower if these firms were led by women, right? Of course, so that in its own doesn't probably, mean too much, because it could either be a supply side effect that these women, as much of the literature suggests, are, generally less likely to be corrupt. They're more honest, have better ethics and so on. But it could also mean that there's a demand side effect at play here, where bureaucrats simply, because they discriminate against women or underestimate firms' productivity and therefore expect to not extract as many or as much rents as with male-led firms. And our results provide evidence for actually demand effects to be at play here. So really reflecting a perverse form of discrimination against women that should be as equally concerning really as the findings on corruption themselves. But that really is just a glimpse for future research, and I want to end it here. So thank you so much for your attention, and we're looking forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? You can type them on the chat, or you can request to speak. Eva, please.
Hi. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading the paper and any future papers that come out of this this sort of research that you have started working on. It's really great. I had a couple of questions, and the first one is linked to the instrumentation, and in particular, the sort of new firm binary indicator as a potential IV. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how that meets the exogeneity criteria, just because it seems like in addition to being more likely to engage with bureaucrats, they're also more likely to have less social capital, and therefore, that might have an effect on bribery rates. So I was wondering if you could just maybe, let us know if you have thought about this and what additional tests have been done. And then on the last graph that you showed on the discrimination of between men and women CEOs, presumably this would show up not just in the bribery levels that you were looking at, but also the administrative time, right? Like women might be more likely to be pushed down the queue in terms of receiving licenses and all sorts of approvals and so on. So yeah, that was more of a comment, not really a question, but really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you again.
Great. Are we collecting, or should I respond to questions as they come in?
However you prefer.
However I prefer. Okay, then probably we can start by, answering questions, and then as more questions come in, we can take them in a bundle maybe. Great. Yeah, thank you, Eva, for your fantastic questions. Really, really helpful. Yeah, we'll take the opportunity now to give you a few pointers on those. So I think on the question of why new firms would be a good predictor or excludable instrument, I think, yeah, you have a valid point there, that they might have less social capital and so on, and be more able to be victimized, essentially, right? But I think there's also another side to it, which is that they are actually new, so they're not that embedded yet in sort of these networks of corruption, right, or nepotism, right? So they didn't have the chance to, especially in those countries that we look at, right, or many of those countries which are included in the survey, right, where we have this problem of endemic corruption, and firms sort of have learned how to deal with these administrative burdens, right? And that is not necessarily true for new firms, right? They would sort of try to go by the books because they don't know better and don't have contacts. So yeah, at least I think that should alleviate some of the concerns around that being still an endogenous, right? And on the second question, whether we looked at waiting times, we did in fact, and did not find any significant differences for women-led versus male-led firms. So it doesn't seem to be the case, but probably there's countervailing effects working, right? So one could be like this sort of less demand that I sort of try to discuss here. But there might be other mechanisms at play. So certainly something we will look more into, and as we develop this additional work here. So thank you so much for your feedback.
Eva, have a follow-up question. Do you disaggregate new firms as those of first-time CEOs and CEOs who had firms before?
New firms as those of first. Okay, so did we take basically a question that's ready-made from the survey, which is the year of establishment, I think. So they code that as, if the firm didn't exist before, or is the first time it's in the survey, right? So I don't think we know whether it's the same CEO or whether it's, a different CEO. Yeah. So that's, I guess, a data limitation, but I'll probably double check on that, because it would help us address this first point. So yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Eva. Anyone have another question? George.
There I am. I'm muted now. Hi, Bernhard. That's good job. Good work on putting the research together, but also good presentation. I just want to kind of follow up on the previous question. So I guess my question is mostly conceptual, but also then extends slightly to more of an operational kind of level. Can I ask, just for clarification, would you classify as administrative burdens an accountability mechanism at the conceptual level? Could an accountability mechanism being conceived as an administrative burden?
That's a great question. It's not, I mean, if we look at the World Bank Enterprise Survey, right, this is not something that would be explicitly measured. So, there you look more into standard things like applying for licenses, getting water, electricity, telephone things set up, from the government side. So I'm definitely with you that, these things obviously have added in our contemporary times, right? ESG requirements and so on, right? Probably something where also my courses would be better placed to give you a response here. So I'll happy to defer on that. But, it didn't come across to me that these sort of, more progressive areas linked to, say, supply chain monitoring or ESG type of regulations would be included in that. I mean, we're still sort of, we have to remember that these can be very, very small firms, right, in very weakly governed countries, right? So you want to probably keep as much general, and comparable the questions as you can.
I did warn George Bernhard that this question will be referred to me. So, but I think he was interested in the survey questions more than what I had to say. But for the record, our position from the literature perspective is that accountability mechanisms can contribute to administrative burdens. Administrative burdens have a subjective element to them, so perception of burdensome, of them being burdensome, and then it comes down to just how complex the regulatory landscape is. Administrative burden by definition means more than it's strictly necessary. So we're talking about clutter, but now clutter is perceived more than it is objective. And in the paper, we have both an objective measure of it and a perceived one. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, my question at this conceptual level is about the fact that if if accountability mechanisms are included or can be perceived as administrative burdens, then you're probably going to have to do a little bit more extra work in trying to explain what is exactly the relationship that you're interpreting. Because particularly given the nature of your dependent variable being corruption, because obviously this accountability mechanism exists to actually combat corruption. So if then you need to kind of nuance your interpretations in relation to that definition at the conceptual level.
Yeah.
Can I follow this up with one more? Very related to this, more at the operational level. And listen, don't take this as a criticism at all. I understand perfectly the trade-off between the super huge and exceptionally good sample that you have in terms of its size, and the construct validity considerations that you have to obviously to trade off for it. But how confident do you feel about the construct validity of your administrative burden measure, given the fact that you use a single question to do that? Do you feel confident about the fact that about the quality of this measurement and whether actually that your measure reflects what you want to actually measure?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think also relevant for many of us here in the call. So I think it's worth pondering a little bit on it, So of course, for those of you working with this data, I mean, you would know that there's more indicators out there that could potentially be relevant for this question, right? So is there a chance to combine them into index, for instance, right? And let the sort of central limit theorem do its work, right? Something like that. The problem is, I guess, that there's even more missing data on these more specific requirements, right? So, and that's quite easy to explain why, I mean, right? So did you ask for an import license? Well, if your firm doesn't import anything, you know, you will never need that, right? So we sort of prioritize this one indicator because we believe that every firm, no matter how big, how small, which sector, will at least in some ways, you know, require an operating license, right? So that, of course, omits pretty much all the informal firms, you know, that you know are not officially formally recognized. So, but you know, that was probably still an acceptable price to pay. And we do run additional analysis looking at specific firms that would, you know, then match up with these more specific questions, right? So we look at exporting firms, for instance, and looking at these trade and export licenses specifically, right? Or the utilities, where we look at water, electricity, and so on, where it was a bit hard for us to, you know, to exclude a priori certain sectors. I mean, who knows which which type of companies need water for, you know, for something. It's very hard to say, right? I mean, so this didn't go very far. So I would, you know, just trust my guts and sort of, you know, go with what makes conceptually sense. And, you know, of course, what we could do is to present correlations and show you that they're generally very high. Across whichever type of question you use. Right? I think the biggest difference, I think, is between this subjective burdens as perceived and the more objective ones, right? Where I think you have cited these problems that you mentioned with these subjective measures, that they could also include things like ESG related, you know, documentation and so on, which is not really what we want to capture here.
You probably don't need me to tell you, but the easy way out of this is just when it comes to the use of measures that, you know, like could leave some room for improvement in terms of their constant validity. Is, you know, if this is used in previous literature, then, you know, comparability of previous findings is a strong point in arguing for these measures. Obviously, you know, that I don't need to make that point. Thanks.
Great, thank you. There was also a small question on age correlations from Evgenia in the chat. So if you throw in firm size, I guess that's what you mean, firm age, sorry, then it wouldn't change the results. And I don't recall that was a significant covariate either. So
I've just been wondering how, if there's any.
Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
So I was wondering if there is any age-related dynamics. What is it?
Yeah. We can definitely check that. Again, from my memory, it didn't change any of the results, or itself had no significant effect.
Thank you.
But thank you for the point. And I see Manuel wanting to come in with a question.
Hello, everybody. So congratulations for the great project. I think it's really exciting. I wanted to hear more about, so Fiesman and his co-authors, right, in Economic Journal, have a recent paper showing that corruption and firm growth, the relationship between corruption and firm growth, using exactly the same surveys that you're using, right? Which and they find that firms that make zero informal payments are kind of not allowed, right? So do not have the opportunity to grow, right? And this is specifically about high corruption countries, right? And it seems that in your project, you focus more on the division between high income, low income countries, right? Or countries across the spectrum of income, but you don't focus necessarily, of course, you're also like trying to measure corruption, right? But have you, how do you, what is your feeling or how your results square with theirs? Right. So this is my first question. And my second question is about, is it a story about competition, right? Because your measures are all sector specific, right? Is it what really matters is the administrative burden that my firms have in relationship with firms in the other sector, right? So is it a story, and then the perceptions argument, right, might become even harder, right? So if you're feeling really that it's all about competition, right, inside the sector with the specific firms in the same region, right? So I was wondering if you can do more heterogeneous treatment effects to show some sectors that maybe are less dependent on administrative burdens, and then like, okay, if they have some administrative burdens that are sector specific, but that does not matter as much. So for us to get like to be able to, with your really careful empirical strategy, to disentangle more things, right? So to go a bit deeper on the mechanisms, but yeah, it would be great to hear your thoughts on these things.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Really fantastic points. I hadn't actually seen that Fisman study yet, so I will do my homework on that and make sure to include it in the next iteration. But the way I see it and the way you describe it, I think our attempts are sort of largely complementary or consistent, in the sense that, if those firms that make no payments, right, informal payments, they don't grow, it's precisely, we are sort of trying to, offer a micro explanation for this macro result then, in the sense that these firms that avoid bribes don't get things done, right? So they face these arbitrary regulations. They don't get their foot on the ground, so to speak. And that's sort of, one implication that we could stress more potentially. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And the second question on the story about competition, guess I have to think more about that. What it really means that we have these sector fixed effects included, and sort of, looking at which firms are more playing by the rules and which ones are bending them. But just to reassure you that this doesn't really do anything to our results, right? So if we drop these sector fixed effects, we also get positive significant results here. So it is a strong and universal relationship, as I sort of tried to outline at the beginning. So, we are quite confident that we're not picking up specific, pockets of variation here, and sort of try to bring home this point that, it's not an issue that is tied to developing countries as such. It might be called differently in rich countries, right? I mean, they're often reluctant to call it corruption there, but still, it's the very same process. So yeah, that's something that we were sort of stricken by. Thank you for your question. And I see Saurabh. You're muted.
Sorry, yeah. Really interesting presentation. I think, I mean, as you can imagine, I was especially interested in that last slide. You spoke a little bit about the gender component, and I don't know, I guess I'm curious if you were to take that further in terms of analysis or interpretation, where you would take that, what would you need to analyze that further and explain why we see those distinctions in gender?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess the unique benefit of the World Bank surveys is that you have questions on whether people got asked for a bribe and how much they actually paid. So, we have a unique opportunity to untangle demand and supply side. So that would be my main leverage here, right? But also, we can also approach it actually from the demand side, right? So with separate data sets, I'm thinking here of, we particularly use the World Value Survey, where it's a large data set, but it, happily for us and fortunately for us, it has occupational information. So we know if people work in the public sector, for instance, right? And so what we did essentially to extract these public sector workers and probe their attitudes towards corruption, right? And especially their attitudes towards, women entrepreneurship. And it is indeed the case that male public sector workers are 20% more likely to agree to statements like, women can't be a good business leader, which is very striking, but, at the same time underlines exactly the mechanism that we have in mind here, which is that, bribe requests are lower because these public officials underestimate firms' productivity when they are run by women.
I'm just wondering, and this is Adina, thanks. I'd love to read that paper too.
Oh, happy to send it to you. Yes.
Because if I remember correctly, I think with the World Bank Enterprise Survey, you get like a percentage of ownership, right?
Yes.
And do you just use a binary for gender?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so
we
I
look
wonder
at
if
the
there's like
small sort of,
yeah,
small scale enterprise,
okay,
so owner run.
Okay.
Yeah, because for big companies, obviously there's different dynamics.
Yeah.
It's not so cleanly identified, not so cleanly isolatable.
Okay.
But yeah, happy to follow up with you on that paper.
Yeah, no, it'd just be really interesting to see that.
I think you would be a great person to talk to. Yeah, and, really just across the road here. So
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Comments? Maybe you want to add something?
I'm just going through the comments. I saw something from Luis Ventura. Not sure that was answered. HIC licensing process not being a real administrative burden.
No, it hasn't been answered. It's a comment.
Yeah, thank you for your helpful comments as well. We will do our homework and look into this for the next iteration.
Yeah, and also for pointing out to the latest FISMAN publication.
Yeah,
it's
I am
quite recent.
on it.
Yeah,
on it.
Well, I think we covered most of the comments. Also, feel free to send us your questions. We will upload this recording and also the slides. And we're here just to keep talking about corruption and anti-corruption. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter so you can find out where the next anti-corruption in progress is going to happen. It's one per month, and it's going to happen usually at the end of the month. And thank you for, we have some messages here. A lot of questions, and they're thanking you, Bernhard. But thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you all the end of March.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thanks.
Great fun.